Hello and good evening, everybody. You're very welcome to the second edition of Ulysses for the Rest of Us. I'm sure you've all been very busy reading in the couple of weeks since the last time we met. My name is Benedict Shepherd-Connolly. I'm the digital curator here at Molly. And I should say, by the way, I know that we have people joining us from all over the world. But we are open in Dublin 6 days a week now. We're delighted to be back open to the public. So do drop into us if you are in Dublin or on the island and visit us sometime soon. So really looking forward to this evening's book club meeting with Conor Habib, author, activist and podcast host. If you haven't checked out Conor's podcast, it's something I really recommend that you do. We'll be posting a link to that later on. But Against Everyone with Conor Habib is the podcast, so well worth a listen. We'll also be posting links to various books and other resources that Conor mentions throughout, so do keep an eye on the chat as you go. A tiny bit of housekeeping from me. We are hopefully going to have a couple of questions towards the end of this event. If you do have specific questions, if you try and put them into the Q&A feature, we're more likely to see them there rather than the chat. But it's lovely to have the conversation going in the chat as well. So please do pass your comments and thoughts and anything else at all in there. We're really lucky this evening now that we have a special guest. Throughout Ulysses for the Rest of Us, we're going to have a couple of special guests joining along the way. And this evening we have Mark O'Connell. And so we're delighted to have Mark here. Mark is actually in the building, in the room with Conor there at a safe distance. So you'll be hearing from them later. Mark, if you're not familiar with Mark's work, Mark O'Connell is the author of Notes from an Apocalypse and To Be a Machine. And To Be a Machine was awarded the 2018 Wellcome Book Prize. Mark is also a recipient of the 2019 Rooney Prize for Irish Literature, and he was shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction. He's a contributor to the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, The Guardian, and the New York Review of Books, and he lives in Dublin with his family. If for anybody interested in hearing more from Mark as well, we've got a really fantastic interview with Mark O'Connell on Radio Molly. Just go to Radio Molly and search for Mark O'Connell there, and it's really from a couple of years ago. Really interesting interview. So before I hand over to Conor for this evening's book club meeting, I just want to remind you that buying Molly membership for yourself, if you're not a member yet, or for a friend, it's really the best way to support programs like these and to support the museum. So please do consider doing that. You can also save 10% on your membership as a member of Ulysses for the Rest of Us. Just use the discount code Ulysses to when you're purchasing your membership, and you'll save 10% there. So please do that sometime soon. We love to see you in the museum, but also at many of our other online events throughout the next year. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Conor Habib for this evening's book club. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Ben. And hey, hello again, everybody. How's it going? How did these chapters go for you? I'm anxious to hear. I'm just going to do what I did last time, which is I'm going to go through each chapter and sort of talk about some themes that were interesting for me. These are not necessarily themes that anybody else would bring up or say were the most important or best themes, but that is basically how I want you all to read it too, which is just sort of notice what you notice, see what stands out for you and on this reading, and just, think about it, mull over it, and enjoy that mulling over. So when we start with episode 4, I'm sure you all noticed there's this radical kind of reset where we begin again. And for me, that ties perfectly into one of the most sort of important theme of this chapter for me, which is incarnating and reincarnation. What does it mean to sort of come here into the world and be fully human? So the book kind of reincarnates itself in this chapter, which I love. We begin again, things get easier again. We get that kind of first chapter tone of things, whereas episode 3 was, as we all know, a bit of a mess. And we even begin with organs, and we get this body in full. We get organs being eaten, organs being used, thought about. And the book here begins to take this very bodily turn that stays with us to the end, where, you know, we last saw Stephen wiping snot on a rock, but then that does not even prepare us for the bodiliness of this chapter. It doesn't shy away from the body at all. There's organs, there's shitting, there's lust. We get a feeling of being on earth more. And there's a sense, I think, in which we see when we bring our bodies to bear, our mind changes. So, like, in other words, we can be intellectuals all we want, like Stephen, but when the body comes into the picture, we think differently. So, if I'm very smart, and like very, very with it, beautiful, but no, if I'm very like, if I'm a very intelligent person, but I have a stomach ache, I'm a different person than if I don't. So, like, when my body is present, I'm thinking differently, even about like the big ideas. There's all kinds of distractions. There's a different way of sort of walking through ideas and intellectualism. And I think that that's part of what's happening here in a way. So, you know, we find Bloom here as we meet him. You know, we find him funny and we find him relatable. At least I do. Maybe I shouldn't say we. Maybe you didn't like him, but I really do. Sometimes he's idiotic. Sometimes he's charitable. Sometimes he's offensive. But for me, he feels more like me than Stephen. Or I should say, at least at 43, he feels more like me. I know Mark is going to talk about this a little bit, so I don't want to steal his thunder on it. But when I read Ulysses, I was just a bit older than Stephen. And reading it now, I'm older than Bloom. And whereas I used to love Stephen, after all, I'd read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man first. And maybe this is something you guys at Molly can link to. There's an audiobook version of that book. So sorry, I can't support the Molly bookstore by saying this, but it's read by Colin Farrell, and it's actually really, really good read. I just listened to it, and engaging with that book again was really great. But I read that first, and so I become connected with Stephen. But my affinities have changed. I really now like Bloom, who's goofy and kind-hearted. He's horny, he's hungry, he's maybe a bit clumsy, but he's intelligent. And his thoughts have this kind of stop and start quality. He interrupts himself a lot, but it's not as if he's not reflective. So, for instance, he is thinking about the Middle East, he's thinking about Zionism, and he resists both Orientalism, that is sort of like exoticizing people in the Middle East, and he also resists Zionism in a way. He's really ahead of his time. So he's imagining the Middle East, and he stops himself, and he's like, probably not a bit like it, really, kind of stuff you read. Like, he will stop to reflect and second guess, which is, you know, although Stephen does that, it's just a much more kind of highfalutin thing that Stephen does. And so when Bloom takes pleasures in things, he's not taking so much pleasure in intellectual stuff in the world. His thoughts are kind of settled into him. He's more interested in the world around him, the sensuous world, simple pleasures. Talking to his cat, for instance. There's that great moment of the NKGNAM meow, that begins the chapter with the cat. And that was actually looked at by a linguist, by the way, who said it was pretty good. Like, if we're going to detail a cat sound in letters, that's pretty good. And it sets off the importance of reading sound, but in this book, which particularly we'll get a bit later on in the book. But his pleasures are kind of bodily. They're about the world, the food and lust and all this. But he's not dumb. And I'm going to come back to the incarnation, reincarnation thing in a second, but he's not dumb. So when Molly, who's also not stupid, asks him what the word metempsychosis means, it's in a book she's reading, he knows. It's transmigration of souls, or if you want to say, oh, rocks, when he says it that way, and more simply, it's reincarnation. Why does he know? Why does Bloom just know that anyway? It's interesting that he just knows that. But reincarnation comes in explicitly in this chapter. And, you know, we saw a kind of transformation of things, the changing of the bodies in the previous episode, where there was sort of a reincarnation. So like all of Stephen's thoughts about things turning into other things kind of lead us into this episode. In this book, I think we we see that this process is happening all the time as we live. We inhabit fictional characters when we read this book. We jump from character to character. We jump from Stephen to Bloom. So in some ways, we reincarnate ourselves in this book. We reset, when the Bloom chapter starts again as well. And, we're even, the characters themselves are reincarnations of the characters in the Odyssey, in a sense, although I said I wouldn't really go into that much. We also inhabit them, and when we think of them, so like Bloom becomes really obsessive about Blazes Boylan, who's going to have sex with Molly, and it's the substance of jealousy. What do I mean by that? So Bloom is obsessed with Blazes Boylan. He's going to have sex with my wife. He's going to have sex with my wife, and that's something that comes up again and again in the book. If you ever think about how you're jealous of someone who might be with your partner, or if somebody has actually been with your partner in the past, or, heaven forbid, if it happens when you're together, the imagination of that act can be so intense that we're actually occupying the scene. Like jealousy and eroticism are kind of distorted versions of each other, and they allow us to inhabit other people. And that, again, is another way of sort of incarnating as someone else. It's like you almost feel yourself in that situation. And certainly Bloom feels it when it comes to Molly. Ulysses is a book of transformation in general. There's transmigration, the inhabiting I was talking about. There's also Bloom's food in this chapter that's transformed into shit, and he imagines the shit being used in a garden as manure. But whatever we transform, the body plays a role. And so when Bloom shits, he's reading Titbits, which is a little joke since Joyce wrote a story intended for this journal, Titbits, I don't think it got into it in life. And so Bloom wipes his ass with a page of Titbits. And Joyce really wants to show us that people do this act of transformation every day. It's something we do every day, and it's excluded from every book. I mean, imagine novels that come out in 1922 depicting shitting. And that's how important presenting this principle of the body, of being incarnated, of being here in this stuff was to him. So Bloom thinks more of the world than Stephen. He's more in the world than Stephen, possibly because of his outsiderness in a way. And I would say for myself, again, the older I get, the less I want to be an intellectual to be reckoned with. And the more I just want to be someone who's just fully here, fully myself, fully like on this planet, fully incarnated, I could say. The more I want to be in the world and in myself and strive to be better. And I think this is part of it. I want to understand this funny stuff I'm in, that I'm wrapped in. And maybe to sum all that up and to move on to the next, because there's a lot of chapters to discuss, there's this really hilarious moment where Bloom is walking and he sees an old woman and he thinks, oh shit, I gotta exercise. I should exercise. But well, he doesn't, right? And so that's that sort of like that struggle or that tension between idealization and the mind and the body and the kinds of ways we feel ourselves in our stuff, in this stuff. All right. In the interest of time, I could say so much more about that chapter, but hopefully some of that resonates with you. I'm going to move on to episode 5 and talk about desire, because this episode really, everything touches on desire here for me. Joyce was very suspicious of Sigmund Freud. He was very suspicious of psychoanalysis. And it's very funny because there's a lot of psychoanalytic themes in this. But basically, I'm not going to talk about Freud too much. I just want to say, like, one of the things that Freud discovered or revealed to people, which I really loved, is, since Aristotle, people have thought you learn something and then you learn something else, and then you discard the old thing you learned, and that's knowledge, and that's how the world works. Knowledge, we're subjects of knowledge. But Freud said, no, that's not how it works. We want things. That's how the world works. So we are actually subjects of desire, and that is the fundamental of everything. And that is so profoundly represented in this episode. This episode is filled with religion and unconsummated sexual desire. And there's a suggestion, I think, that desire is religion here. The Christ, the Buddha, the floating penis as the lotus flower at the end, which is the symbol of Buddhism. If we saw in the first episode that the forces that shape people in Ireland, we're seeing here the force that shapes everyone, which is desire. And it's a desire we keep praying to or watering or, wanking out of ourselves, frankly. Fantasies, I think for Joyce, and I think it shows up here, fantasies, sexual fantasies and longings and prayers are all kinds of similar stuff. Like we pray because we want. We pray because we want to appeal to something. We want something to happen for us. We want a relationship with this other, this God. So fantasies are prayers, and they're prayers that we make without even meaning to. And fantasies can show up anywhere. So for Joyce, prayer and sex, religion and desire are intimately connected. And our most common prayer is a prayer of longing to be close to others, either through sex or truth or in our fantasies or frustration. It's a prayer that, like the plants that populate this chapter, there are lots of plants in this chapter, are always growing. They're always unfolding. As Bloom reads this very sexual letter he gets, we sort of get the letter, we sort of don't, but we do get that it is intensely sexual for him. He was worried that this person might not respond to him at all, Martha, because he was so sexual in his last letter. And as an aside, I should note, she responds to him by a pseudonym, Henry Flower. And that's actually weirdly based on a murder trial. Remember, I mentioned somewhere that Joyce was obsessed with courts. But actually, that was not inspired by that. Sorry, I should say that came later. Anyway, so we see the desire there. And at church, there's this prayer. This is the prayer at the church. Blessed Michael, Archangel, defend us in the hour of conflict. Be our safeguard against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust Satan down to hell, and with him those other wicked spirits who wander through the world for the ruin of souls. Joyce made a mockery of this prayer to a friend once. And so I want to read that to you just to show you this way in which Joyce thinks and which shows up for me really intensely in this chapter. I wouldn't say he made fun of the prayer so much as he turned it into something he really meant, which was basically a prayer for his dick against syphilis. So Joyce's prayer was, Blessed Michael, the ass angel, propel us into the hour of contact. Be our safeguard against the wickedness and snares of the Sif fiend. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, thrust syphilis down to hell, and with him all the wicked spirits who wander through the world for the ruin of tools. So for Joyce, I think very clearly, and in this episode, sex and prayer are both longings, and so they are intimately tied together. Joyce did get syphilis, by the way, so his prayer to that God was probably not successful or irritated God. All right, so episode 6. The theme here, I'm sorry I'm going really fast. We've got a lot going on, so I hope I'm just sending you in interesting directions, and maybe there's something that you're like, oh yeah, I thought of that, or maybe you didn't think of it, or maybe you think I'm like saying something completely idiotic and you have a really interesting thought about the idiocy that's coming out of my mouth. So whatever works for you, great. This episode for me is such a deeply compassionate episode. Compassion, which means to suffer with. We really, in this episode, begin to see the interconnectedness of the people in Dublin and in the book in general. It's been happening a bit, but now, we see Stephen and, walking as the cart goes by. We see Stephen's father. We get a doubling of some of the themes. So, for instance, Bloom thinks of his father's last wish, which he honored, whereas Stephen didn't honor his mother's last wish when she died, to take care of his father's dog. unlike Stephen, who's afraid of dogs. So we're also building on the style. At the same time, we're leaving the main characters a bit. We sort of wander away from them. And we get this kind of hint that this book is not just bound to the main characters. So there's a little bit of this act of compassion here, like, look at all these other people. And this will be really exploded in an episode to come, which people refer to as The Wandering Rocks, which is one of my favorite ones of this whole book. I think for me in this episode, we get a real sense of Bloom's kindness, his consideration, holding his tongue, thinking about how to care for others, even in death, the way people are transported and buried. Should they bury them standing? He's thinking about Patty Dignam's family. He notices the tramp and he thinks of the poor man who has been disbarred, the priest. He even thinks of the right moment to shuffle the soap around from one pocket to the other so as not to disturb the normal flow of conversation and perhaps not to elicit any embarrassment since he's very hygienic. He's thinking about what the dead are feeling and have felt. He's thinking about, it's like the donkey. So St. Francis said this thing when it's like just this story of St. Francis where it's like, what would you have done differently? Someone said to St. Francis at the end of his life, he said, I would have treated the mule or I would have treated the donkey better. And so Bloom is thinking about the donkey. He's thinking about the dead who are famous. He's thinking about Parnell and the way that the other dead are forgotten with each shovelful. And at the end, Bloom even helps John Henry Menton with his hat, which is popped inward a bit. And so perhaps all this helping is in some ways relating us to grief and removing it from us, removing us from grief. So perhaps by constantly being concerned for others, we're not exactly seeing our own lives, but we're just constantly giving out from our own lives. So we can see this, Bloom is so concerned with everybody else. He's like, oh shit, did I tear up the envelope from Martha Clifford? Am I being too rude with my soap? And so maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. Maybe when we're feeling one thing, we're avoiding feeling another. But for me, this episode seems really compassionate. And I think one of the most remarkable things about this book happens in this episode to elicit a sort of sense of compassion. At the funeral, there's a man in a Macintosh and like a raincoat. And a lot of people have written about this. I wrote a paper about this the first time I read Ulysses when I was an undergraduate in college. Now, I'm not going to say like, well, my paper was a genius paper, but I still do like what I wrote and the way I think about this character who nobody can quite figure out who it is. I mean, there have been whole treatises on like, who is this person? Because Joyce knew where everything was in the book. But this person is a mystery. And what I wrote way back then was that this person actually is the reader. So this person in the Macintosh is you put into the book at the funeral. There were so many ways that Ulysses implicates us and brings us in. Everyone in this Dublin, particularly at the funeral, knows everyone, but we as readers are unfamiliar to them. And I think there's something really special about that. Like maybe we project ourselves onto the blank face. So there's this type of schooling called Waldorf schooling started by this guy, Rudolf Steiner. And we won't talk about it too much, but one of the things about Waldorf schools is that they have, for the kids, they have dolls that don't have faces, which sounds creepy, but the principle is that the kids should be able to project the face that they want onto the doll. Like they're co-creating what they think the doll actually looks like. And I think, this man in the Macintosh gives us a chance to project ourselves into the crowd in the book. And I think also like there's something really special about this because Joyce is like, I know where everything is. In fact, he wrote one of the episodes with a stopwatch and a map. And we'll talk about that in that lecture, but he can't know. I feel in some ways he himself didn't know who that man in the Macintosh was. He was saying, it's going to be you, the reader. I'm leaving a space in here that's unknowable for me too. Just like death is totally unknowable, there is a presence here unknown to the characters, unknown to Joyce, and it's a spot that only we as readers can fill in. And therefore, we're putting ourselves in that crowd and allowing for a different kind of compassion. And the book's allowing for compassion for us as well. And all of this is in the face of death, this great togetherness that we all face, death. Compassion means to suffer with. And I think Bloom exemplifies this, always thinking of the other because he can see a sort of togetherness. All right, 2 more. And then Mark's going to talk, and you all are going to ask questions, and I hope you're enjoying it up to this point. So, episode 7. This is what this chapter is for me, is there's a sort of there's a sort of exhaustingness to everyday life and impenetrability to everyday life. What do I mean? Well, this episode could be, if you let it be, one of the most difficult episodes of the book, because it's filled, not because of that headline style in it, but because it's filled with references to events and people. Some of the characters are basically real people. There are many, many, many places and topical allusions. But, that's just part of this. Having spent 3 episodes each with Daedalus and Bloom, their character, the forces shaping them, as well as the general foundational style of the book, we now enter into a Ulysses that allows the ways we communicate, how they reflect different modes and states of consciousness to unfold. And the book is never the same after this. We're encountering multiple states of consciousness every day in our own lives, right? When we're reading, when we're falling asleep, when we're dreaming, when we're taking in art, when we're drunk, and so on. And episode 7 is where Joyce allows the additional states that come from different tones of existence to interpenetrate the book. And again, after this, he does that again and again and again in every episode. And it's really beautiful. And the fact that he pulls it off is pretty amazing. So here we have this chapter told with headlines and follow-ups, contrived and sensational language and puns. There's an audiobook of this that I love, read by Jim Norton, where he shouts out the headlines. So it's kind of that extra, like he shouts the headlines. And I love that. We have journalism, we have reportage, and we have tabloid journalism. And, this whole episode is filled with hot air, a kind of emptiness. There's lots going on, but it's not nourishing us or enriching us. I want to give a little aside here. There's a small moment when J.J. O'Malloy asks Stephen about Madame Blavatsky and A.E., who is a theosophical Irish writer. In the email that I had sent out to everybody, there was a bit on the Theosophical Society and A.E. or George Russell. I'm actually wearing a shirt that is a Theosophical Society design from this book called Thought Forms that these theosophists created. They were very interested in understanding what happens in the inner world, the sort of occult contours of the inner world. And Theosophical Society had a huge influence on the world and still has a big influence today. But I can't really go into that too much, except just to say Joyce had investigated these figures on his own. He met A.E., so that's a real person, was, ultimately disappointed by meeting him because A.E., George Russell, wasn't interested enough in the individual. And this actually comes up in one of the episodes. And then the themes of Hermeticism show up: Egypt, Isis, Osiris, the Akashic record. Stuart Gilbert, who worked with Joyce, said, Joyce really had an affinity for both reincarnation and this thing, the Akashic record, that all our thoughts go into something that never goes away. Everything's recorded in this cosmic record, this Akashic record. And Stephen's thoughts are drawn, perhaps in spite of himself, to the occult. Anyway, I find that all very interesting. Stephen is sort of wandering through the differences between life and the news in this chapter and the entirety of the chapter. And he tells this great story, and I'm not going to spend too much more time on this episode, but he tells this great story about 2 women who eat their plums at the top of Nelson's Pillar. Now, I didn't really know anything about Nelson's Pillar before I moved to Dublin, and I had almost expected to see it here, but it had been since destroyed. But these two women go to the top of Nelson's Pillar, and Stephen tells the story. He loves it, even though it falls a little flat when he's telling it to the others. And he talks about it as if it's sort of like these two people going up to the top of the pillar that is huge in the center of Dublin and looking out at everything. But by the time they get up there, they're exhausted and there's nothing to do and there's nothing to talk about. So all they can do is just sort of spit the plum pits out. So by the time they can survey, it's kind of too late for them to engage in the passion that they want to engage in. Sort of like Moses seeing the promised land, but not being allowed to enter it. The women see it, but they can't enter. They can't immerse in it. They can only peer on it as exhausted spectators. And that is what reading the news is like. So I find this really brilliant move here at the end to tell this story. If you pick up a newspaper, if you turn on CNN or RTE or whatever, it's just like, please shut up. Like, it's too much. I can't take it. And day after day after day after day, you're turning me into a spectator instead of a participant. And it's exhausting. The news is a view of the world that never really gives you entry. It's just spectating. And interestingly, that's also how this chapter works. It's just a flood of shit. And you can't really get in. It's such a brilliant move because it provides a punchline to the chapter and also a key as to why the chapter is so dense and unenterable. So again, the news events of life let us see the world but never enter into it. We'll get back to a view of the city where we actually do enter, which again is in this episode, The Wandering Rocks, which I really love, but we'll come back to that when it's time. Okay, last one. And then I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who's been sitting here listening to the lecture with you all this whole time. This episode for me, episode 8, is about healing and overcoming and replenishment. So people say that this chapter is about eating. Yeah, I mean, it is definitely about eating. There's lots of eating, but it's also about what becomes of us through eating, how it happens, and about replenishment. When we eat, we replace ourselves. Lots of things are just this sort of turning over, this healing, this giving away and growing back in this book. So here's a passage in my edition. It's on page 135, where the whole city is just constantly just being turned over and reworked and healed and replenished and reasserted again. Cityful passing away, other cityful coming, passing away too, other coming on, passing on. Houses, lines of houses, streets, miles of pavements, piled up bricks, stones, changing hands. This owner, that. Landlord never dies, they say. Other steps into his shoes when he gets to his notice to quit. They buy the place up with gold and they still have all the gold, swindle in it somewhere, piled up in the cities, worn away, age after age, pyramids in the sand, built on bread and onions, slaves, Chinese wall, Babylon, big stones left, round towers, rest, rubble, sprawling suburbs, jerry built, Kerwin's mushroom houses built to breeze, shelter for the night. No one is anything. So Bloom thinks that, I believe, or maybe not, maybe it's just part of the narrative, but then he later imagines his own life before his son died and how that has changed his relationship with his wife. And he has a sexual correspondence with Martha now. So he's starting this other sort of kind of fake relationship, but who is he himself? So he thinks, I was happier then, or was that I? Or am I now I? Can't bring back time like holding water in your hand. I don't know if you've read this or you know this like parable or whatever it is. It's I should probably know what this is from. Mark will tell me what it's from because I'm sure he knows. But what's the thing about the ship that's built, and if you take a plank of wood out and you put a new plank of wood in, until you have the same ship, but it's completely new planks of wood, is that actually the same ship if you just take out and replace them one by one? So that's something I think about here. There is a kind of replenishment that happens through subtraction and addition. But then who are you when you heal? Who are you when you replenish? I was happier then, or was that I, or am I now I? I love that line. Bloom thinks about sweetness and poison. He thinks about seagulls eating the food people throw them. He thinks about, the things we eat that may not be our natural food. He throws paper to these seagulls. Of course, they don't want it, they get excited and then they reject it. And not coincidentally, it's a paper that has gospel on it. And then he gets real food for them. He sees an old love. He sees Mrs. Breen, who he rejected for Molly. So he left that and then he found Molly. He thinks about vegetarianism, how it may be nourishing, how it may be replenishing, or maybe it will leave someone undernourished. He rejects vegetarianism a bit, but then he goes to order a cheese sandwich. And when he enters Burton's to eat, he thinks, not here, I don't see them, I don't see him. So he's thinking of Blazes Boylan there, as far as I'm concerned. He wants to keep track of Blazes Boylan. He wants to bump into him, even though he doesn't want to bump into him at all. So again, there's this sort of tension, like what gives us nourishment? What heals us? What replenishes us? And what actually damages us? It's sometimes hard to know. So when he's talking about, the things that poison us, that's what we make our medicine out of. That's true in homeopathy, but it's also true in allopathic medicine. The things that poison us actually heal us. Isn't that weird? So I really want to see this guy that's going to sleep with my wife. I want to track him down, but I definitely don't want to see him. We're repulsed and attracted. Joyce had this feeling, by the way, in his own life when he had thought about Nora cheating on him. He's just like, tell me all the details. Tell me all the details. How dare you? How dare you? How dare you? Tell me. Like this is real tension. This feeling is overwhelming. This is, another psychoanalytic concept. There's this concept called jouissance. It's a feeling that's so overwhelming and is filled with attraction and repulsion all at once. And it can be healing or it can be devastating, or it can devastate you and heal you. Like if you ever go to therapy, they say there's a breakthrough when you like fall apart in the therapist's office. Why should that be the healing moment? Jouissance is unresolvable and can destroy you if you're not careful. And this is why we see Bloom fleeing to Burns. And there are two flies having sex, like in the moment of their death, like on a windowsill. Like they're having sex, but they're definitely going to die. Like all flies die on the windowsill. I mean, we could say that they would die. They died doing what they loved, but they're stuck there. So the interesting thing is there's that jouissance where he's like, shit, Blazes is going to sleep with Molly. He's going to sleep with Molly. He's going to sleep with Molly. But then he turns it. And there's this sublime or beautiful thing where he thinks about kissing Molly and how she had some seed cake in her mouth when he kissed her and how you could taste it. It's such a beautiful moment. I mean, even as it could be disgusting, like you kiss somebody and there's some food in their mouth. But when you're in love, the repulsive becomes not just acceptable, but beautiful. It becomes nourishing. Anything can become nourishing to you. It can replenish you. Everything rises into beauty. Finally, at the end, he spots Blazes Boylan. And Boylan hasn't yet seen him. And in this moment, there's this dizzying fever pitch. It's not just that Bloom doesn't want to be spotted by Boylan. He doesn't want Boylan seeing Bloom see him. So he pretends to look at a building, to be looking for something in his pocket. He wants to be seen as innocent. He doesn't want to be seen as engaging in this intensity. And it's of utmost importance to Bloom that Blazes not know that Bloom knows the affair is happening. It has to unfold on its own. He doesn't want to interfere. Bloom almost wants the affair to happen, but he also doesn't want it to happen. He could, after all, confront Blazes and Molly and be like, what the hell's going on? But he doesn't. He wants to stay obsessed with what's going on. Like I said before, jealousy and eroticizing are two sides of the same coin. And he's stuck in that. Do I allow myself to become sick with it, or do I replenish myself? Do I heal myself? And how can I tell which one is which? So that's a whole lot. And I'm I'm very excited that someone else gets to talk for a little bit now. So I'm going to let Mark talk. Now, Mark is going to talk about what the book means to him, why it has value to him. So he's not going to, I don't think, go into some sort of scholarly discussion, but rather just sort of place himself where you all are. Like, why does this have value? You know, what does this do for me? So I'm just excited. Like, I just knew right away when I decided I want to have some people come on and just be like, this book is really, awesome. I knew I wanted to have Mark on to talk about it. So I'm going to shut up for a little bit now and let Mark talk. So Mark, I guess your camera, your mic, and your sound. Yeah.
Thanks, Connor. Yeah, I'm not going to go into any detail or talk about any specific aspect of the book for the simple reason that I haven't reread it in, I would say, close to a decade. When you asked me to do this, I kind of thought, the sort of broad heading that you gave me was like, what does Ulysses mean to me? And it's an interesting question, because I instinctively feel that it means something to have read Ulysses. I read it a couple of times in my 20s. I read it first, like Connor, actually. I read it first as an undergraduate. So I think I was 21. So I was basically, when I read it, Stephen was my guy. Stephen was the person who I sort of most closely identified with. And then I read it again as a postgraduate student in my sort of mid to late 20s. And at that point, I felt I was sort of drifting between Stephen and Bloom in terms of age. And then I went back, and it's probably 5 or 6 years ago, didn't reread it entirely, but read sort of parts of it again. And like you, I realized that, shockingly, I was older than Leopold Bloom. And now I'm just getting older than him every day. And that's a sort of a weird, disorienting kind of position to be occupying. But yeah, the thing I wanted to think about was like, what does it mean to have read Ulysses? Because it is quite a long time ago now. And when you read any book, particularly a book as gigantic and capacious and kind of world encircling as Ulysses, you're not going to retain all of it, but you do retain certain things quite vividly and quite sharply, and you retain a sense of the book. And I think there's something, for me, certainly, there's something different about having read Ulysses than having read, say, another book that, I think of as absolutely crucial to my kind of readerly life, which would be like a book like Moby Dick, or a book like Anna Karenina, or any of the other kind of big kind of, classics that I might have read at a certain point. Ulysses has stayed with me in a different way. And I think the reason for that is pretty obvious. The reason for that actually is that I live in Dublin, and I've lived in Dublin since my late teens. And the relationship between Dublin and Ulysses is something I think fairly unique, actually, in literature. I can't think of another city-book relationship that is as intimate as the relationship between Dublin and Ulysses. Obviously, Ulysses is a book about Dublin in a way that, say, Moby Dick is not a book about Nantucket, or Anna Karenina is not a book about St. Petersburg in quite the same way. But I think it has to do with, as well, to do with the size of Dublin. Like, Dublin is obviously a very literary city, but it's a city that is quite small. And Ulysses is a vast book in every conceivable sense. So there's something about this relationship that seems, I almost think of it, the word I would use is consubstantial, that Ulysses is Dublin in a way, in my mind. And so even though it's a long time since I've read the book fully, and there are large parts of it that I just don't remember, it's really interesting to hear you talking about those chapters, because it comes back to me, but a lot of it, it's as though I might as well not have read it, actually, because it's been so long. But living in Dublin, it's as though you're always kind of reading Ulysses in a way. It's always coming back to you. So yeah, there's this kind of inseparability between Joyce and between Dublin that is really a very kind of vibrant aspect of the experience of the city for me. It's as though the real map of Dublin is kind of overlaid by a fictional map, so that when you're walking through the city, And I, like a lot of Dubliners, I walk a lot. My kind of main experience of the city still is walking. You kind of inevitably, as a consequence of moving through the city, think about these characters. You think, you encounter these ghosts. For a long time before the pandemic, I worked in the National Library, and pretty much every day I would be in there, and there wasn't a day that went by when I wouldn't think about the encounter between Stephen and Bloom, where they kind of pass each other at the door. Every time I walk through the door, I would think of that. There's a plaque with the name of, I guess you guys haven't got to this bit yet, right? I know you have.
What's that?
Of the chapter in the National Library. You've got to that bit? That's about to come, right? Yeah, sorry for spoilers are okay when it comes to Ulysses. There's no spoiling Ulysses. But there's so many examples of that. I live in Dublin 7, and my route between my house and the city centre is full of kind of Joycean ghosts in a way. Every morning I walk my son to school, and I pass by. We're getting into Dubliners, I guess, a bit here, but the house on Usher's Island where the Dead is set and where Joyce's actual aunts lived. I walk past that house every day, and there's just so many aspects of Dublin where you were kind of forced to think about Joyce. So I guess like once you've read Ulysses, it kind of deepens your perception of the city. It fills it with these kind of ghosts, and it becomes, in a way, almost like a sort of, I sometimes think of it like an immersive, interactive kind of virtual reality experience or something, or like an augmented reality experience. A few years ago, I was asked to come and try out this actual virtual reality game that a bunch of tech people and a bunch of Joyceans in Boston College had come up with, and it was really interesting. It was like basically you put on the VR helmet and you become Bloom. You become Bloom in his kitchen in chapter 4, and you're frying up the liver or the kidneys or whatever it is, and the cat is swirling around your legs and all that kind of stuff. And it was really interesting. Also slightly nauseating in that way the virtual reality can be. And you go up onto the roof of the tower and you're Stephen all of a sudden. And so it's quite interesting, but also it struck me as weirdly kind of superfluous, because that's what Dublin actually is. Dublin is this kind of augmented reality Ulysses experience once you've read the book. I think that's what is different about having read Ulysses when you live in Dublin to, say, having read any other kind of book. And that's, I think, a real phenomenon, actually. And I'm sure I'm not the only person to think about this a lot and to speak about this. But it is a real thing. And I see it as being distinct from those other aspects of the relationship between Dublin and Ulysses, which is the kind of, the Bloomsday sort of phenomenon, which I think is quite lovely. And I think it's great that people can turn their love of Joyce, even if it's only in an abstract way, even if they haven't read the book, this sort of kind of harmless sort of LARPing element of, dressing up and eating liver or whatever it is. But then there's also the kind of use of Joyce as a pressing him into service as a kind of a cultural ambassador for Dublin tourism, which I find at times can be a little bit uncomfortable in terms of thinking about Joyce in the city. A few years ago, the Irish state named one of its very small number of battleships after James Joyce. One of the other ones was named after Beckett, which I think left a lot of people with a sort of a bad taste in their mouth. Another thing that sort of struck me was the embroidering of lines from Ulysses on the seats on Aer Lingus flights. Struck me as a little bit crass. But the big thing that sort of got me in recent years, and I got actually strained, I don't get angry about a lot of things in this way, but there was a motion put to Dublin City Council about 2 years ago. Conor probably remembers this. It was a motion to have Joyce's bones dug up from the Flanterne Cemetery in Zurich and brought back to Dublin in time for the 100th anniversary of the publication of Ulysses next year. Joyce himself never expressed apparently any wish to be buried here. Obviously his relationship with Ireland, and I'm sure you guys have touched on this, his relationship with this country, and particularly official Ireland, was very vexed, but he never wanted to be brought back here. Nora apparently did express a wish that he be repatriated, so there was kind of a claim that her wishes were being respected. But one of the things that was said at the time, one of the Dublin city councillors who brought this motion forward said, I'm not going to be cynical about bones, but I think it's something Joycean lovers would appreciate. I don't want to calculate something like this in shillings and pence, but I don't think it would do any harm. I think it would do some good. It's a very Irish way of expressing, I think we could make a few quid out of it. And I thought that was just both like shockingly cynical, actually, and also kind of indicative of the darker side of the relationship between Ireland, between Dublin and Joyce. And it made me quite angry, actually, this idea that Joyce could be physically, bodily dug up from his final resting place and brought back home to Ireland as a kind of a feather in the cap of Dublin's kind of sense of itself as a literary, cultural kind of capital. And I wrote at the time, I wrote a opinion piece for The Guardian about it. And I said, forgive me for quoting myself here, I said, a century after the publication of Ulysses, capitalism, which has since supplanted Catholicism as Ireland's officially professed faith, had come to see the value of Joyce and his work, finally. He has taken his place in the pantheon of Irish brands as a sort of Arthur Guinness of literary modernism. The old sow wanted the bones of her farrow back because there was still some meat to gnaw on. But the fact, I think, ultimately for me was that this idea of digging up Joyce's bones and bringing them back to Dublin in a way that was sort of reflected the more benevolent superfluity of the idea of a Ulysses virtual reality kind of experience. It was completely superfluous because Joyce is already in the city's bones in this really kind of quite visceral way, actually, to literally dig up his bones and bring them here is sort of besides the point and in kind of a meaningless, futile gesture. Because Joyce's presence in this city is, for me, already almost overdetermined and almost overbearing at times in its intimacy and imminence. So my sort of feeling is that if you care about his actual work as opposed to the sort of revenue streams that it might represent, Dublin is already completely inseparable from Joyce. Even in his absence, there's absolutely no getting away from him. If you live in Dublin, you are constantly, if you've read Ulysses, certainly you're constantly in this ongoing relationship with Joyce, and you're actually always reading Ulysses and you never stop. So that was just what I wanted to say about my own personal kind of feeling about Joyce and Dublin. Thanks.
I'm going to turn my mic and whatever on, so you know, turn your.
Yeah.
Wait, what's that? Oh, the ship of Theseus. Thank you for that. Actually, I think you don't have to. I think we're okay. So, yeah, I just want to say to what Mark said. First of all, that's all of Mark's writing always has these like, it's overall great, and then like he'll sink into a line like that where it's just like, oof. So like I really appreciate that, and I think like the thing about the LARPing, right? Like where people dress up on Bloomsday, and maybe some of you who read the book have done that, and you were like, I want to read this book that I dress up as. Or the virtual reality thing or whatever, but especially around Dublin, the Bloomsday celebration, I really do love that in the sense of the idea that a book has so permeated people's lives that they don't have to read it to live in it is really striking. And like you said, that legacy, everywhere you turn, you are it, you are in it. In some ways, Dublin is a monument to the book, which is so strange. I mean, it's just such a strange turn of events. And I think that, when people say things like, what will the next Ulysses be? Like I've heard people say that as if it could be another book. It could never be a book that would be the next Ulysses. It would have to be a way that people lived, or a conversation, or something so strange that we can't even quite foresee it because it's so complex. So I love everything you said. I want to I think that Molly will post this for you, but I did an episode of my show with Mark right at the beginning of the pandemic. So it was episode 105 of my show, and Mark's book Notes from an Apocalypse had just come out. And then here we found ourselves in this sort of weird thing. But during this during the lockdowns and everything, I did, as a foreigner here, as an immigrant, I did find comfort in seeing the contours of the city that I recognized from the book. Like, it always felt like a companion in that way. So, I mean, maybe that sounds like a really lonely, like, loser thing to say, like, well, I was inside the book that I loved, but I did find a lot of comfort in the fact that it was inescapable here for me. So there would be, a place, and if you read Richard Ellman's biography, also of, if you read Richard Ellman's biography of Joyce, it also has all these like places. Here's the link to my to that episode. It has all these places in it. I mean, there's just nowhere, almost in Ireland, it feels like, that Joyce didn't touch, much less, this book. So anyway, we have some questions, and we're just going to answer a few, and then we're going to get going. But if Mark has something that he wants to add, great. And if you don't want to add anything to these answers or these questions, okay. So one is, maybe you do have some. Is there significance in this first sighting of Stephen by Bloom on his way to the funeral? They meet again in episode 7 in the printing works, but is a brief encounter, but they end up spending most of the evening and night together. So I think maybe what I would sort of want to talk about here, and maybe you have something to say about this, is those sort of missed connections. I mean, you've lived in Dublin, for so long, and I haven't, but the missed connections here seem actually quite common,
Yeah, I look at. I mean, that is one of the reasons why I think Dublin is the city that is Ulysses, because you couldn't set Ulysses in London or New York or Los Angeles or whatever. I think it would be a very different kind of book. It's absolutely believable that all these kind of, random sort of stochastic encounters happen on the streets of Dublin. I mean, I was just thinking as we were talking, actually, that, I bumped into you around the corner from my house the other day, and you had a sandwich in my front garden, and that probably wouldn't happen. We don't live in the same neighborhood, but that seems like a very Dublin thing to happen, Yeah, and I think like it's a city, and like that's one of the, not to get all sort of misty-eyed about Dublin. There's a lot of problems with the place, but one of the great things is that you just like, there is this sense of like the texture of the city being completely determined by, you're going to, like, you walk out the door and you're going to, if you've lived here for long enough, you're going to bump into someone, you're going to have some kind of an encounter on the street, no matter where you are, almost. And I think that's, one of the things that is absolutely like crucial about the relationship between Dublin and Ulysses.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's right. It's funny. It just happened to us the other day. And if I hadn't gotten my sandwich at that, like if it hadn't completed at that moment, you would have walked right on by. Yeah. So here's another one. Do you think Picasso and Cubism had much of an influence on Ulysses? Joyce and Picasso were pretty much the same age. Ulysses was written when Cubism was most prevalent in Europe, and some of the passages do tend towards the abstract while still being recognizable as narrative text. There's always multiple points of view used as well. Listen, I actually am going to have a hard time answering this, because I don't know enough about Cubism or Picasso, but I will say, like, look, just the sheer amount of like artistic brilliance that was, that we have, at least, documents from Europe. I mean, I'm sure it's happening in the rest of the world, but and spiritual and everything. It's just like, this was the time of, Walter Benjamin and Wittgenstein and and then and Picasso, and overlapping with Rudolf Steiner and AE and all these people. I mean, there's just all this huge fluorescence of something breaking through consciousness itself in this time. And I just think it's really profound. So I can't speak to that one particular influence. I know that Joyce had his affinities and the things that he hated. Like I said, he was suspicious of psychoanalysis. I mean, so you had Carl Jung around, and even though Jung analyzed Joyce's daughter after some resistance, Joyce was like, "No, this guy's an idiot. Like, he's saying that the precise things that make my daughter brilliant are the things that are wrong with her." And so I think like he liked some of the brilliant people. He didn't like some of the other. I mean, and some of them did not like him. F. Scott Fitzgerald like got down on his knees in front of Joyce at the time and said, "Tell me to do anything. If you tell me to jump out that window right now, I'll jump out the window to my death." And I think Joyce, it was like Hemingway was there, and Joyce was like, "That young man's going to hurt himself," And so this is all this stuff happening. So it'd be really hard to pinpoint that specific influence for me, unless you know something specific about it. But I don't. No. Okay. And we'll do one more question. Okay. So how about this? Yeah, this is a good one. They're all good, but I like this one to answer. Reading these chapters myself, I never caught wind that Bloom was thinking about his wife sleeping with another man. So much of the messages of the book are lost on me because I don't understand words and references. I was thinking that looking up every unknown word would take so long, I wouldn't be able to keep up with the group. Do you think I should keep reading apace with the group, not knowing words, or slow down and look everything up? So I'll just answer, and then you can sort of say, I mean, I talk about this in the prep video. So if you just look like, no, just read it. I mean, the famous quote is that the first time you read Ulysses is the second time you read Ulysses, right? So in some ways, it's just to get this under your skin in a way, and just to enjoy what's happening. I've read this book. I think this is the 8th or 9th time I've read it, and through, and like, I miss shit all the time. And then things that I take in, I lose them the next time. So I just don't worry about that. Do you have any tips on that, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first time I read it, I missed everything. I read it in like my second or third year in college, and I did this course called Reading Ulysses, and I read it with a really kind of mercenary kind of attitude, and I read it with this you can get these kind of guidebooks that sort of like a key book that tells you what's happening at every stage of every episode. And that was almost kind of unhelpful, because I thought I had a handle on it, and I was just, I was almost more reading the guidebook than I was reading Ulysses. And I think, I mean, you're going to miss loads of stuff. It's like, that's the sort of the way that the book is structured, is that you can't pick up on everything. But I think, I would say also just, it's difficult to read at your own pace, of course, when you're doing something like this. But my ideal sort of way of reading Ulysses would be to kind of read, 2, 3, 4 pages a day. Obviously, that's not possible in this situation, but you just sort of read slowly and carefully, but also with an attitude that, you're not going to get everything. There are jokes that, nobody but Joyce probably would have appreciated, or a handful of people. So not to get too hung up on that stuff as well, I guess.
Yeah. Great. So you basically were both saying like you have absolute permission to not get anything. So I hope that helps. And I think with that, that's it. I just want to thank you again, Mark, for hanging out and talking about why this book meant something to you. And I want to thank everybody for reading it. Now, listen, next time it is 9, 10, and 11. So just 9, 10, and 11. Okay. I know some of you have editions of the book that don't have the episodes neatly delineated, but I will leave that to you to figure out, because there are lots of different editions. But here, episodes 9, 10, and 11. And the walkthroughs, I think, are up for those. And we're going to get on it. Now, let me just warn you, chapter 9 is my most hated chapter of the book. And it's the one that Mark was talking about that happens in the library. But I also love it. I love it. It's just like, it's a long intellectual conversation, but just know that then 10 is my favorite. So we jump from 9 to 10, right? And I just want to make sure I'm right about that. Yes, and then 10 is my favorite. So anyway, Mark's turned his camera off. So but he's still here. So I just want to say again, thank you so much, Mark. And thank you everybody for coming, hanging out, reading the book. And please talk to each other about it. And the date for the next one, all that kind of stuff will all be sent to you in an email. But basically it's in 2 weeks. Okay. So that's it. 2 weeks, 3 more chapters. Everybody, thanks.